It reminded me of like the Brave New World, like the pills that people were always taking.
Yeah, totally. I just thought
You're
of
a little,
Adderall.
you should,
Yeah.
yeah.
It sounds a bit like Adderall. I mean, it's
Totally,
good
though.
though.
Like, they'll totally just lie to us and sell us some, like, SSRI and say, no, it's totally infused with, like, AI nanites that control
Yeah.
everything on a micro. Like, it's just the same bullshit.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the books? Quick, spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book? You got the book! In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand! Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Well, welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club, where we are continuing our journey through the dawn of everything, written by the Davids, Graeber and Wengrow. Today we're discussing Chapter 7, which is titled The Ecology of Freedom, How Farming First Hopped, Stumbled, and Bluffed Its Way Around the World. And so I thought maybe I could just start by glossing the argument of the chapter, because this is a relatively short chapter. I don't know how long it'll take us to, go through the details of everything to discuss, but we might just want to unpack some of the ideas they're working with to orient ourselves around where we're at in the book. This is like the middle of the book. And so I kind of understood the rough argument of this chapter to be something like farming doesn't necessarily lead to permanent hierarchy or the extinction of hunting, gathering, and seasonal living. Right? They kind of use the metaphor of relationships. They talk about flirting with farming, as opposed to, I guess, being married to farming. And so that's kind of what they're getting at in a lot of ways. And I thought on page 260, it's not the beginning of the chapter, but it felt like the most clear version of their argument or overview of their argument in the chapter. Thought I could read these, a little bit of this on 260, the top section, just read through that. And then we can get going with the discussion and take it wherever you guys think it's interesting to go in this chapter. But the authors are talking about this idea of the ecology of freedom. And ecology, just as a science, is like the study of an ecosystem, right? You can think about a wetland environment as one kind of ecology, or a desert environment as another kind of ecology. And there's a way to study how all the different organisms and resources within that environment interdependently create it, right? And what are the necessary conditions for that to sustain and everything. So the ecology of freedom is like the study of like how an environment would sustainably create the conditions for human beings to experience what we might define as freedom. So we also have to define freedom in a loose way. But anyway, this is where they're getting into the weeds of that argument. By ecology of freedom, by this, we mean something quite specific. If peasants are people existentially involved in cultivation, then the ecology of freedom, play farming, in short, is precisely the opposite condition. The ecology of freedom describes the proclivity of human societies to move freely in and out of farming, to farm without fully becoming farmers, raise crops and animals without surrendering too much of one's existence to the logistical rigors of agriculture, and retain a food web sufficiently broad as to prevent cultivation from becoming a matter of life and death. It is just this sort of ecological flexibility that tends to be excluded from conventional narratives of world history, which present the planting of a single seed as a point of no return. Moving freely in and out of farming in this way, or hovering on its threshold, turns out to be something our species has done successfully for a large part of its past. Such fluid ecological arrangements, combining garden cultivation, flood retreat farming on the margins of lakes or springs, small-scale landscape management, for example by burning, pruning, and terracing, and the corralling or keeping of animals in semi-wild states, combined with a spectrum of hunting, fishing, and collecting activities, were once typical of human societies in many parts of the world. Often these activities were sustained for thousands of years and not infrequently supported large populations. As we'll see, they may also have been crucial to the survival of those first human populations to incorporate domesticated plants and animals. Biodiversity, not biopower, was the initial key to the growth of Neolithic food production. So, as a question, how is farming like a toxic relationship?
It's like you think you can't get out of it, but really, it's just an experiment and you can leave whenever you want. And sometimes it's good to leave.
You need like domestic violence shelters for previously agricultural civilizations or something like that. Is that too off color of a joke to make? I don't know.
We'll review it in post. The toxic relationship. Arthur, you kind of nailed it, but yeah, it was talking about, I think, some of the tribes that really got into cultivating certain plants or domesticating certain species, how they're just all of a sudden linked with these, and they literally can't, like, they feel like they can't leave because now they're responsible, because now, like, at least for the animal life, the way it was talking about is like they've created these herds that wouldn't survive on their own. So now they have to manage this constantly, and it's like you've created a trap for yourself essentially, right? That you can't leave.
Yeah, it's like those weird balance between freedom and constraint when it comes to your resources. I don't know, before really reading this book, I hadn't thought about explicitly how resources can be constraining. You think you have a resource, you can just use it. You don't really think about how your dependency on that resource and its dependency on your management activities can constrain, I don't know, like that's kind of like the danger of a monocultural dependency, right? If we all just depend on corn, then we're freaking married to corn in this terrible toxic relationship. And, no matter how much corn abuses us or we abuse corn, like we're still stuck with corn. How can we get out of the trap? How can we get unstuck? I just thought it was an interesting way to think about that relationship in a new way. I don't know, that metaphor kind of struck me as interesting.
Not exactly the same thing, but kind of related. Something that really stuck out to me. You're saying like what toxic relationship that farming could have. There was a part in here that made me think about invasive species and how it had like a comparison of some of the domesticated plants that the Europeans brought over to America as almost an invasive species in that sense. And so I want to read like this section here, Thoughts or Theories, from Alfred W. Crosby on page 256. So it's a little ways down that third paragraph. And this is talking about ecological imperialism. Crosby went on to argue that the global ascendance of European economies since the 16th century could be accounted for by the process he called ecological imperialism. The temperate zones of North America and Oceania, as Crosby pointed out, were ideally suited to Eurasian crops and livestock, not only because of their climate, but because they possessed few native competitors and no local parasites such as the various funguses, insects, or field mice that had developed to specialize in sharing human-grown wheat. Unleashed on such fresh environments, old world domesticates went into reproductive overdrive, even going feral again in some cases. Outgrowing and outgrazing local flora and fauna, they began to turn native ecosystems on their heads, creating neo-Europes, carbon copies of European environments of the sort one sees today when driving through the countryside of New Zealand's North Island, for example, or much of New England. The ecological assault on native habitats also included infectious diseases such as smallpox and measles, which originated in the old world environments where humans and cattle cohabitated. While European plants thrived in the absence of pests, disease brought with domestic animals or by humans accustomed to living alongside them wreaked havoc on indigenous populations, creating casualty rates as high as 95%, even in places where settlers were not enslaving or actively massacring the indigenous population, which of course they often were. So the comparison there that I drew was, in the Adirondack Park anyway, there's a couple invasive species that we have. There's the purple loosestrife was one that my mom always talked about growing up, and it's like this really pretty purple plant. I have no idea what it's for, but it has no competitors and it will just take over wetlands here. There was one that grew on the road between Newcomb and Minerva that we would literally stop every time and like rip it out of the ground. Like it would just keep coming back. That's what I thought of. They're talking about it back then. There was no check on this. Today, we take that sort of thing very seriously when there's a non-native plant or animal species like the ash borer beetle that's killing massive forests on the East Coast. And it's going to eventually get to the Adirondacks too and take out like the ash trees. So I just thought that comparison was really interesting, that like this farming or this style of domestication like spreads almost like an invasive species when brought to these places.
It made me think if one of these diseases or things you're talking about are responsible for what happened to the American chestnut. You know, how it just, wherever the chestnut blight came from, if that was also like, you know, a product of colonialism, because that only happened like, what, 150 years ago? Wasn't that long ago that all the chestnuts died. Yeah, it kind of makes me, well, the thought that it brings up, this passage you read, and just thinking about how the environments we grew up with and everything, like I grew up in the Carolinas, and I remember just seeing a lot of kudzu and people talking about how kudzu would just take over a grove of trees, and you could just see the shape of trees in an area, but all you really see are green vines covering the shapes of trees. And that's something that I grew up seeing. The thought that it brings up is it makes me kind of sad that we don't get to see these environments in their natural state. You know what I mean? We're left with the aftermath of all of this ecological imperialism that you were describing. I guess that's the main thing that's coming up for me, is just sadness about missing out. I have FOMO about seeing a natural environment where I grew up and not knowing what it naturally should look like.
That's probably something that people, when we joke about like time machines and going back, don't think about too much. Like, what does it look like differently just from that perspective? Like, what wasn't around or what was, right? I mean, I think people would probably be surprised at the megafauna, right?
Yeah, I think they're trying to bring it back even.
Oh, like with the unfreezing the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and everything.
Yeah, and like something about it can like absorb CO2 at a rate that's like, exponentially higher than any other plant or something. So they want to like bring back to curb all the fossil fuel usage.
Yeah, that made me think about, I can't remember where it's at in this chapter, but somewhere they had mentioned how these ecosystems have changed post the most recent ice age. So like 10 to 12,000 years ago, how things have changed, and how there was actually a period of rapid cooling in the North Americas, especially like 5,000 years ago. But the way that they made the argument, I wish I could remember where it was at in the chapter.
It's actually right after 157, or it's the next page, 158, when it talks about like the Holocene era and the Anthropocene. That was really interesting.
Yeah, the little ice age.
Yeah, because I'm just trying to trace back the cause here. Yeah, quite likely, they say on that page you pointed out, European expansion of the Americas played a role, with perhaps 90% of the indigenous population eliminated by the effects of conquest and infectious diseases. Forests reclaimed regions in which terraced agriculture and irrigation had been practiced for centuries. In Mesoamerica, Amazonia, and the Andes, some 50 million hectares of cultivated land may have reverted to wilderness. Carbon uptake from vegetation increased on a scale sufficient to change the Earth system and bring about a human-driven phase of global cooling. I thought that was a really fascinating kind of factoid to think about.
It made me think, like, if somehow we could band together as a species and create mega cities people would actually want to live in, and just leave the rest of the land to go back to the way it was. It's like, would that be an effective way of reversing some of the human-made warming that occurs? I mean, that's kind of the implication that you get from the book, though. I guess those megacities would have to also be carbon neutral or whatnot. But
we just build differently, like get really good at energy efficient, temperature regulated mud houses, and not have the need for all these cooling systems and electricity grids and everything. If you build the house the right way, this is just learning from indigenous communities at this point, like learning how y'all used to build houses and still do, and let's like scale that up and make it more normalized and make it weird to have AC. I don't know. I say that as someone who lives with AC and enjoys the comforts of AC, but like we've been around for a really long time. AC was invented like 100 years ago or something. So yeah, I can imagine a more spread out type of civilization just using different structural technologies so that, it's not as tech dependent for keeping a cool, comfortable environment.
I guess semi-related to that, but not totally related to the book. But I was at my uncle's over this weekend, on Saturday, and he has this old log cabin that he had moved from one place to his house. It was the first building that went up on his property, and it is just straight up logs, and then there's a specific name for it, but like horsehair in between, like, and he's like, yeah, like, it's got one wood stove, and you could live in that through the winter time. Up here, winters are pretty cold, but you could definitely do it. We don't even need to go back 5,000 years or whatever to still find like technologies that worked and that people could live in.
Yeah. Another thing that I kind of wanted to maybe talk about, they point out in this chapter a number of different regions, basically continental highlighted zones: Eurasia, Africa, Oceania, and America, and point out some commonalities and differences. So for the first three, Eurasia, Africa, and Oceania, they had a lot of these farming communities were seriously committed to a couple of crops or a couple of species that they were domesticating. And they tended to have hard boundaries, both physically, ecologically, as well as culturally or linguistically. And they sort of contrast this to the Amazonian communities that were not super dependent on one or two species and did not have these hard boundaries to define. This whole section starts, this discussion of the Amazonian farmers starts on 266. I thought their whole pet culture was interesting too, because like they're hunters, they're gatherers, they're small-time play farmers, and some of the species that they hunt, that they had young offspring, so they kill an adult animal, and that adult animal has some young offspring. They would take in the young offspring as pets and like love them and treat them like pets the way we do today. And how this was just a different approach to farming in general. And so on page 268, I'm just going to read this paragraph at the bottom of that section where they say, in other words, there was no obvious cultural route in Amazonia that might lead humans to become both the primary carers for and consumers of other species. Relationships were either too remote in the case of game or too intimate in the case of pets. We are dealing here with people who possess all the requisite ecological skills to raise crops and livestock, but who nevertheless pull back from the threshold, maintaining a careful balancing act between forager, or better perhaps forester, and farmer. So rather than being married to farming, these Amazonian communities are just kind of casually dating farming, just seeing how it goes from time, pulling back when they don't like it, using it when it's useful. I thought that was an interesting approach to, and a counter narrative to this whole assumption that planting a seed leads to massive cities and hierarchy and settled, civilizations and things like that.
Yeah, and in this, I love too in this section and the one right before it, when they talk about the Nile and Amazonia and these regions, it's like this play experimentation also occurred in various different social arrangements, and it had a plurality of these beginnings. That animal thing I thought was really cool, though. I loved it. It's like maybe it's the guilt from eating the mature one, but I would definitely be raising some animals there.
Really kind of sends home the point, right? These guys can absolutely farm. They figured that out. They figured out how to raise and domesticate animals, but choosing not to. It almost feels like, everything in moderation, right? Like anything in moderation, you can get by. I don't know. I don't know if there's a parallel to straight up capitalism in there as well. Like we're full blown on the capitalism right now, all the way, all gas, no brakes. But I don't know. Is there a middle ground, right? Is there a Nordic middle ground that, is something that people point to? I felt like there was kind of a parallel in that.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, like you bring up a lot throughout the whole podcast, Cody. You mentioned just like core values and having to trying to normalize a conversation around core values and get some shared footing there to figure out some of the answers to these hard problems. And capitalism always comes back as like an obvious bad core value to have if like your core value is profit and surplus and things like that. And just from the perspective of some of these civilizations we've been reading about, even the ones who do hunt and kill animals or make use of animals for protein and diet and stuff have a certain reverence or respect for the species and think about the way they relate to it and what we would call sustainability today, just like carefully balancing that relationship and how from their perspective, how grotesque and just otherworldly modern factory farming must appear from their eyes, right? The idea that we have these massive warehouses just slam full of animals just suffering every day. Like we kill billions and billions of animals every year for protein in a very cruel and heartless way. And just like, where's the discussion about core values there when we're talking about another species that we're in relationship to? I don't know, it just made me think about that.
I really think that's a great comparison. And actually, there's a part earlier in the chapter that I highlighted that kind of goes along with that, which was actually right at the beginning. So this was on page 250. And I think you started off the conversation today about how some societies had really strict views on ownership of land and like boxing that in for things, and this is kind of the other side of it. So I'm just going to read this one. It's from like almost all the way down that second paragraph. So any student of agrarian societies knows that people inclined to expand agricultural sustainably without privatizing land or surrendering its management to a class of overseers have always found ways to do so. Communal tenure, open fields principles, periodic redistribution of plots, and cooperative management of pasture are not particularly exceptional and were often practiced for centuries in the same locations. The Russian Mir is a famous example, but similar systems of land redistribution once existed all over Europe, from the highlands of Scotland to the Balkans, occasionally into very recent times. The Anglo-Saxon term was runrig, or rundale. Of course, the rules of redistribution varied from one case to the next. In some, it was made per stips. I don't know. In others, according to the number of people in the family. Most often, the precise location of each strip was determined by lottery, with each family receiving one strip per land tract of differing quality, so that nobody was obliged to travel much further than anyone else to his fields or to work soil of consistently lower quality. It's kind of like made me think of something very similar there. It's trying to find a equitable way to redistribute land to work, and it's not like you own it, right? It's communal, and that worked for a lot of societies, and it's probably better for the land itself. And I just thought that was a very cool fact that has existed back then, but also up till now, right? Like more recent times. Like it's not, thousands and thousands of years ago. We have to look back for that, I guess, is what I was thought. And it made me think, these guys better farmers?
Yeah, I like that point too. I took a class in sustainability in grad school. I did the PhD in English, but we had opportunities to take interdisciplinary classes. There was a big push, especially in the humanities, for departments to work together, geographers working with English professors, working with history professors, and so on, just trying to come together on stuff. So I took a class in sustainability, ran by an English professor, a geographer, and a wildlife ecologist. Really interesting kind of class. Management-wise, it was chaotic. They didn't really teach well together. It was kind of a nightmare teaching-wise, but we talked about some interesting topics and stuff. Soil erosion was a big thing that came up again and again, and how this whole system of capitalism does not have a very long futuristic outlook when it comes to management of soil. You can think about the Dust Bowl in the early 1900s in Middle America, but just how constant use of the topsoil again and again without replenishing it just sucks all the nutrients out and destroys it after a while. And how there's I can't remember the specific principle, but basically if you have 10 acres of land that you're trying to farm, you should farm on 1 acre each year and leave the other 9 acres alone and rotate that acre that you farm every year. And so you're only farming on a specific piece of land once every 10 years and giving it 9 years to replenish itself and regenerate. And how it's just totally antithetical to the way we produce food today. But there's a lot of examples in this chapter, especially like the Amazonian people who had that sort of topsoil management practice going on at the same time, basically composting to keep everything nutrient dense and good for growing. That's what it made me think about.
I think highlighting it, I guess what it made me think of here is that even though they have the opportunity to put themselves in a hierarchy over nature, a lot of these cultures have the ethical framework to restrain themselves and rotate and keep in mind restorative practices. And colonialism really overtook that. And of course we get the whole narrative of the inevitability of hierarchy, but now there just seems to be no relationship to nature at all. And it is definitely I think what we've talked about, farming, and it's literally just industrialism.
Yeah, on this narrative of the assumption that starting farming leads in a straight, very swift line to massive cities, massive hierarchy, massive control, and like an administrative state and all that stuff. They say on page 255 here, they're talking about this, how seeds spread. And they had this line that I love, talking about seed spreading. They say, but this has less to do with the nature of seed cultivation itself than with the imperial and commercial expansion. They say seeds can spread very quickly if those carrying them have an army and are driven by the need endlessly to expand their enterprises to maintain profits. And it's like, yeah, that's how we get to where we are today. It takes a lot of ingenuity and serious planning in an aggressive, merciless way, which goes totally against not just conservation, but sustainability. You know, we can use the land, we can have a relationship to it, but we have to make sure that it continues to produce the conditions in which we can use it. Otherwise, we're dooming ourselves to destroy the only planet we've got, right?
That was the argument that, one of the arguments that the early settlers made, like the indigenous people weren't properly using the land, right? Like, as in they weren't just destroying it. But I really like this concept that you guys are kind of getting back and forth, which is the disconnect that we have in the modern world from where our food comes from, both from a growing crops perspective and from livestock perspective. Like that disconnect of how that food gets to your plate and what that means for the damage that can do to the world. I guess like for those earlier societies, it was very evident, right? Like if we, oh shit, we did this one place like 4 times in a row and now nothing's growing there. We gotta, but like people today, like what, I don't even know I'm just going to make up a number, but I'm assuming it's like 99% of people like have no idea like what it actually takes to farm. Like I'm one of them for sure. Like
Yeah,
not
me
really.
too. Yeah, and that's kind of like, I don't know, I think it's important to think about that kind of thing as an intentional control mechanism of like our collective ignorance about how to produce food sustainably is a kind of unfreedom, right? Is a kind of relinquishment of a certain kind of freedom. These Amazonian people that we're talking about in this chapter were completely free in the sense that they could move anywhere throughout the year and find a way to feed themselves and live comfortably. When we, as a species, tie ourselves to a couple of crops and a couple of animals, you know, you could talk about corn, wheat, chickens, pigs, cows, and that's most of the American diet right there, right? Think about how many products on the shelves at grocery stores are just made from corn. It's astounding. Not only that species level dependence on a handful of crops, but how on an individual level, as individual humans like us, we don't know how to do it ourselves. Like I'm trying to grow food at home. It's hard. Like I don't know what I'm doing. It's really hard to learn how to grow your own food and to do it well and sustainably. And that's an intentional kind of unfreedom that keeps us dependent on these systems and complicit in all the stuff that's going on. So as individuals, as local communities, learning to grow our own food, learning to feed each other in our neighborhoods and stuff, that's a hugely revolutionary practice.
Yeah, it's like reworking the myth that there's this idea that primitive is bad and stupid and Neolithic and barbaric, and it's actually like intelligent design, and to the point of like the 1 acre, 9 acres, leaving it. Like nowadays, you know, Elon would walk up to it and be like, why are you wasting 9 acres here? We got to extract, you know, and they would. And that's like the problem with capitalism is it just means continuous production forever. And then it views all land that you're not using as like wasted. And yikes, it's just a lot more carbon in the air, I think. Yeah. I mean, think about the carbon released from methane of these cows and how they talk about the Amazon being a perfect garden area the size of a continent. And right now, I think the deforestation there is used for cow production, which of course leads to more methane in the air. I just thought, what's the oxygen levels like? And what's your brain operating like with all of this pure oxygen versus now? And like we have, I don't know. It got me into like conspiracy theory thinking, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And back to your point, Joe, I mean, it's on the same thing. You're saying like how many things are made out of corn. Like we've got to the point where well past creating the amount we need to just feed the people, like to the point where it's like, well, we've got all this corn, so let's just feed the corn directly to all of the livestock and make corn syrup and all these crazy things, instead of what do we actually need to produce every year in order to sustain the population of 300 million people. Again, I am talking about things that I have no real knowledge of, but it just,
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to be expert farmers or even ecologists to really understand something that obviously doesn't make sense from a sustainability point of view. If the goal is to have human beings on this planet living healthily with the planet's resources for longevity, if that's the goal, to be here for a long time and to enjoy this planet, then a lot of the things we're doing right now don't make any sense. A lot of things we're doing right now lead straight to decline, to resources being gone, to massive starvation and suffering. And so if the point isn't that to live a long time on the planet, then the point must be something else, which is shareholder returns.
get rich. Was it get rich or die trying? Get rich and kill everybody else along the way? I don't know. Like the commodification of everything too, right? Like what are the things that, you actually need to survive as a human? You need food, shelter, and I don't know, is that it? Is there anything else?
That's it. But a lot of people like clothes
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. I'll just throw that into the shelter. But like that and like medical, right? Like I think like those three things, like if you and we just try to squeeze every dollar we can out of all of those things, right? Like that's what the goal is, like healthcare. Like I'm going through a switch in insurance right now, so it's just like interesting. Like it's not interesting; it's frustrating as hell. Like talking to insurance companies and figuring out what's covered, what's not. Like why is it that way? And it's like it's
Oh God, yeah,
not gonna get
insurance,
better for a lot of people.
the most infuriating industry to analyze by far, just health insurance or any kind of like life insurance. We started using, I guess it's DPC, direct primary care. But we started going to a place that does direct primary care. You pay a monthly fee that's pretty low, and you basically pay a la carte for any healthcare stuff you get, like blood work or tests or exams and follow-ups and stuff. And it's all very affordable, and like it does cost money, but there's not like this massive health insurance premium you have to pay. There's not co-pays or deductibles to keep track of. It's very straightforward. Yeah, I don't know if you have any direct primary care shops in your area. I know the Adirondack Park is kind of limited for stuff like that, but yeah, different, because people in the healthcare industry, like healthcare providers, doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners and physician's assistants and stuff like that, are also fed up with the system. And so some of them are starting to innovate and create new ways of providing care to communities that aren't as dependent on the health insurance industry. So if you can look into a direct primary care option near you, I would definitely recommend that.
We'll add one to the commune. Get a longhouse for that.
Thinking about these Amazonian groups in particular, there was a moment on, starts at the bottom of 270, which just continues that first paragraph at 271 that I wanted to read, and just thinking about this as an elaboration of this different way of playing with farming that we've been talking about. The authors write, play farming of this sort in the Amazon as elsewhere has had its recent advantages for indigenous peoples. Elaborate and unpredictable subsistence routines are an excellent deterrent against the colonial state, an ecology of freedom in the literal sense. It is difficult to tax and monitor a group that refuses to stay in one location, obtaining its livelihood without making long-term commitments to fixed resources or growing much of its food invisibly underground, as with tubers and other root vegetables. While this may be so, the deeper history of the American tropics shows that similarly loose and flexible patterns of food production sustained civilizational growth on a continent-wide scale long before Europeans arrived. So I thought that was an interesting moment because it points to two things, really. One is a sort of revolutionary thing to consider, is that the more diverse your food sources are, the more mobile your community is, the less able an authoritarian government is to track and control you. And the other thing is that they're suggesting that this diverse style of food production and sustainability that they're pointing to in the Amazon also is able to sustain large-scale populations, which is sort of antithetical to the whole agrarian narrative that you need massive monocultural production to sustain large populations. They're suggesting that in the Amazon, there was a large population that was sustained by these very practices that we think would not work on a large scale. So I thought that was an interesting moment to think about.
Yeah, it reminded me of the last chapter. They do the same thing, and maybe even the chapters before with like the Play Kings, but using that kind of play experimentation without like the domineering effect of capitalism, where like it made me think how capitalism relies on these fixed systems of like, obviously like land ownership, but like mobility itself like breaks that link between private power and territory, I guess, and like the rotation is preventing like overuse, and they have this terra preta, the black earth, that they're what we talked about, like they're rejuvenating the land with like bones and all this stuff, making their own like compost essentially, and the communal access. It's like I just miss that. We have some like community farms, like little plots that you can kind of enter into a lottery, and maybe you'll get one that's maybe near to you, whatever. But like this whole system just seems perfect. And why don't we all have these societies like this? I don't know. We need like a human landscape that's a lot more effective and more communal.
Yeah, totally. And it's also a massive like educational undertaking to like, I mean, you'd have to start doing this like in kindergarten, and maybe some really good, probably private schools, let's be honest, are doing this, but you'd have to, it'd be part of like your human upbringing. Your birthright as a human being is to learn how to use the land sustainably to feed yourself and your family. And we're not taught how to do that. We are taught how to count and how to show up from 9 to 5 days a week on time. And we're taught to respect authority and accept punishment when we do bad. And so we're taught how to fit into a slot as a worker, but we're not taught how to be a human being on the planet and to have a relationship to the planet and to learn how to grow food and take care of things on our own. And it begs the question, why? Get back into conspiracy theory territory with you.
Yeah, it makes me think like how, I guess I thought of Israel and other countries that like, they conscript people into armies. And I think like, why isn't there some sort of conscription into like farming or like actual skills that you need, where after, whatever year of schooling, you have like 2 years or whatever, where you actually learn these things and you can contribute.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. It made me think, I don't know if you've read The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, but the communist moon society has a sort of rotational job system like that. That's kind of interesting. You're talking about the draft and like conscription, like how nation states will force human beings to offer themselves up as cannon fodder for wars that rich people can avoid getting into. Just going through Howard Zinn's People's History with my students this semester, this comes up every time a war happens. It happened with the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, of how the nation state realizes they need to do a war, and they say, okay, we need a certain number of people in order to fight this war. Let's ask for volunteers. Not enough volunteers show up, so they have to do a draft. It happened the same thing in World War I. They said in order for the United States to enter the war, we need 1 million volunteers. They got like 70,000. And then Congress overwhelmingly voted to enact a draft.
It's a really good comparison between the two, I think, from what is it? It's not conscription. What is it? Involuntary service, mandatory service. What's the flowery language they put out? I think it's mandatory service that Israel has, like for 2 years. You have to join the army for 2 years, like if you're in Israel after you get out of high school. And I used to think something like that in the U.S., not to necessarily join the military, but some type of civic service would be a good thing in getting people more civically involved in the United States as a nation state. But what I really like what you're saying, Joe, is what you're saying is like, we should have some sort of service to make you a Earth citizen, like something like that. That's more about like, hey, we're all here on this planet. Like you can pledge your whatever to this country, but that country might not have the best interest of humanity. Like no matter who's leading it now, like who could be leading it in 10 years, right? Like that can change. But best interest of humanity on the planet in general, right? Like I just like that kind of comparison there.
Yeah, I think I was just riffing on Arthur's idea about that.
Yeah, it's forced, and you don't get a choice. It's interesting too, like, I mean, not to get like too off topic, but like the whole Israel 2-year thing, it's like, is there just like a perpetual war then? Like, what about in these times of peace? Question mark. There aren't any. But like, if in the US, like, if there are times of peace, like, how come we can't shift the military draft to farming draft? Maybe we're too early, and like in the future when we have these monocrop failures, there is going to be a farming draft, and who knows?
No, I've had so many conversations with my grandpa about this. He's been on this using the military draft for good kind of idea for a while, and we've had some back and forth about that over the years. But yeah, it kind of, the whole scenario is like, what if the nation state, instead of serving capitalism, served the interests of average people? It would be great, but you have to create a nation state that is not beholden to capitalism. The way that makes the most sense for me to understand how the U.S. government in particular, but how nation-state governments in general worked as they've been basically a product of European colonialism, is that capitalists have a government, and they use that government to settle disputes between themselves peacefully, and they use that government to control the masses to produce the labor and manage the resources that they need to maintain it. So as average people, we don't really have a government. The corporations have a government, but they tell us it's ours so that we'll trust it and invest our time and energy into it and vote for it and things like that. But in order to get to the kind of thing that we're talking about, using the draft for good to take care of everybody, we have to reorient the priorities of the nation state away from capitalism and towards the people. That's just revolutionary shop talk right there. I mean, that's... In your adventures with philosophy, Arthur, have you run into this word telos or teleology? I thought maybe we could close by just talking about that concept.
Yeah, I know that it means like purpose, but that's about it. It's like a goal that one aims to achieve. I think I came across it in some like old Greek, stuff.
Yeah, I don't know why it became such a like buzzword in grad school that everybody was just playing with, like teleological and anti-teleological and all this stuff. But they end the chapter with this in that section title. What does it all matter? A quick reprise on the dangers of teleological reasoning. To I guess put it simply, is like the narrative we've been talking about of how there is a direct path to where we are now, and as soon as we start farming, this is obviously where we have to end up. That line of thinking is an example of like teleological reasoning, that it, like Arthur said, it leads to a goal. There's a specific end in mind, and the momentum goes directly toward that end, and there's no way out of it. And so people use this as a way to unravel some of that reasoning. And so I thought maybe we could just talk about that concept in general, to think about how it relates to the end of the book, or how it relates to the book in general, because it seems to me that that's sort of a gloss for their whole argument in the book, is they're trying to pull back away from that assumption that this is where we necessarily have to end up. The way they call it, we're stuck now. It's not like human society progressed to this point. From the author's point of view, human society got stuck in this point, and they're trying to figure out how to get unstuck. So they say, in this chapter, we have tracked the fate of some of the world's first farmers as they hopped, stumbled, and bluffed their way around the globe with mixed success. But what does this tell us about the overall course of human history? Surely the skeptical reader might object, what matters in the wider scheme of things are not the first faltering steps toward agriculture, but its long-term effects. After all, by no later than 2000 BC, agriculture was supporting great cities from China to the Mediterranean, and by 500 BC, food-producing societies of one sort or another had colonized pretty much all of Eurasia, with the exception of southern Africa, the subarctic region, and a handful of subtropical islands. A skeptic might continue, agriculture alone could unlock the carrying capacity of lands that foragers were either unable or unwilling to exploit to anything like the same degree. So long as people were willing to give up their mobility and settle, even small parcels of arable soil could be made to yield food surpluses, especially once plows and irrigation were introduced. Even if there were temporary downturns or even catastrophic failures, over the long term the odds were surely always stacked in favor of those who could intensify land use to sustain ever larger and denser populations. And let's face it, the same skeptic might conclude the world's population could only grow from perhaps 5 million at the start of the Holocene to 900 million by AD 1800, and now to billions because of agriculture. How, too, for that matter, could such large populations be fed without chains of command to organize the masses, formal offices of leadership, full-time administrators, soldiers, police, and other non-food producers, who in turn could only be supported by the surpluses that agriculture provides? These seem like reasonable questions to ask, and those who make the first point almost invariably make the second. But in doing so, they risk parting company with history. You can't simply jump from the beginning of the story to the end and then just assume you know what happened in the middle. Well, you can, but then you're slipping back into the very fairy tales we've been dealing with throughout this book. So instead, let's recap very briefly what we learned about the origins and spread of farming, and then turn to examine some of the more dramatic things that actually did happen to human societies over the last 5,000 or so years. Farming, as we can now see, often started out as an economy of deprivation. You only invented it when there was nothing else to be done, which is why it tended to happen first in areas where wild resources were thinnest on the ground. It was the odd one out in the strategies of the early Holocene, but it had explosive growth potential, especially after domestic livestock were added to cereal crops. Even so, it was the new kid on the block. Since the first farmers made more rubbish and often built houses of baked mud, they are also more visible to archaeologists. That's one reason why imaginative infilling is necessary if we want to avoid missing the action going on in much richer environments at the same time among populations still largely reliant on wild resources. Seasonally erected monuments like those of Göbekli Tepe or Lake Shigirsko are as clear a signal as one could wish for that big things were afoot among Holocene hunter-fisher-gatherers. But what were all the non-farming people doing, and where were they living for the rest of the time? Upland forested areas like the uplands of eastern Turkey or the foothills of the Urals are one candidate, but since most construction was in wood, very little of this habitation survives. Most likely the largest communities were concentrated around lakes, rivers, and coastlands, and especially at their junctures, delta environments, such as those of southern Mesopotamia, the lower reaches of the Nile, and the Indus, where many of the world's first cities arose, and to which we must now turn in order to find out exactly what living in large and densely populated settlements really did and did not imply for the development of human societies.
Nice.
The thing that I really liked from that passage was, I think it was like 274, the second big paragraph there was where it was talking about how it kind of gave us the why, or a why, as far as why archaeologists would see more of the agricultural societies, which I thought was a good point to bring up. Like, just because, yeah, that would be a question. If this is how people lived, well, they lived more with the environment, and that sort of went back to, so less impact, less visibility. And it also reminded me, I don't know if you guys have seen a Sasquatch Sunset. Have you guys seen that? It's a kind of a goofy movie, but it's about the last tribe of Sasquatch living in North America. And they like travel around and they build houses, and then they break them down the next morning and put it all back to normal, and then they keep going. So it's like, yeah, no evidence. So I guess I'm saying Sasquatch is real, but that was a cool paragraph.
Totally, yeah. It's a thought I've had a lot, because I think about the scale of human history sometimes and how little we still know as far as the archaeological record goes, how little we know about so much of human history. Like they've mentioned in here, 200,000 years of human beings living on the earth. And even the stuff that they're talking about that we're finding fascinating only goes back 10, 15, 20,000 years, right? It's not that far back. In order to know what happened, there has to be some kind of artifact or evidence. And so if you're a sustainable kind of culture, you're using material like wood that breaks down over time, there's nothing left for us to study. How much has gone on that we're just ignorant about, that we have no way of knowing about? Like, was writing and literature invented on a medium that is just decayed and gone and we have no evidence of? How many times have we invented writing is a question that I often think about. There's so much history we don't know.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Like how much could get erased and how much could come back. And I think about like I took like an astronomy class, and the professor was describing like, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And if you take that timeline from your fingernail to your shoulder, and you start at the fingernail, like we're at basically the fingertip. Like that's how little time has gone on. It's been like, we've been around for like it's just insane. Yeah, like I loved in this chapter, like, or the ending here of like what's the point, or what did they say? But why does it all matter? Like, yeah, this Aristotle, telos, everything having a purpose. I remember some professor talking about like an acorn, the purpose is to like become a tree, and how like Western history really takes this, I guess not Western history, but like the Western industry that currently takes this idea of having a purpose and a goal. The end result is capitalism. More like Nietzschean thought would be that it doesn't embrace the chaos of the world. There is really no goal. Maybe life should be about creation without this expectation of purpose, and the whole purpose just kind of exhausts you, and then you're living to fulfill a goal or an achievement rather than making value out of creation and what life could be, like this beautiful dance, and the dance is the meaning rather than the achievement. So it's a really interesting idea to flip the whole myth, and they've done it really successfully for other myths too. So it's really going to be cool to see how they take this and leverage it and like go towards their argument. I was going to say their goal, but that wouldn't make any sense because their whole thing is going against that. Yeah.
I love that. It's like play over profit. Right? We can make play an end in and of itself and make that way more interesting and useful and desirable than something as boring and old hat as profit at this point.
Exactly.
Maybe think about the protests too, like the people in suits and even like the nudists in Portland, I guess, who were just teasing ICE agents and stuff. Like, yeah, someone had pointed out, someone was doing a take on that protest style, and they call it tactical frivolity. Like being playful on purpose as a resistance technique. I love that. Yeah, let's play. Let's be way more interested in play than we are in profit. Join us next time where we continue with the dawn of everything, and we will discuss Chapter 8, Imaginary Cities. Eurasia's first urbanites in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Ukraine, and China, and how they built cities without kings. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.